They called her washed up. Too old, too soft, too quiet for a military kitchen. The soldiers snickered when she moved slowly through prep work, mocked her gentle voice, her methodical approach to everything, until 3 armed men burst through the mess hall doors. A ceramic ladle, chipped from years of use, became something else entirely in her hands. No one expected what happened next except the base commander, who whispered afterward, "That's Elena Vasquez. She used to hunt people for a living." Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Want to know what happened next? Make sure you're subscribed and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories reach. Chief Warrant Officer Elena Vasquez stood in the doorway of the mess hall kitchen at Fort Meridian, surveying her new domain with the same quiet intensity she'd once reserved for studying enemy positions. The industrial kitchen stretched before her like a battlefield mapped in stainless steel and ceramic tile. Commercial ranges lined the walls. Like artillery pieces, their surfaces scarred by countless meals and careless handling. Steam tables waited empty, their metal surfaces reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights that never quite warmed the space. At 43, Elena carried herself with the careful economy of movement that came from years of understanding that wasted. Motion could mean the difference between success and failure. Her graying hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, secured with the kind of practical clips that suggested function over fashion. Her uniform was spotless but showed the subtle signs of long wear, fabric that had been washed and pressed countless times until it achieved the soft comfort of familiarity. The morning prep crew was already assembled, a collection of young soldiers who'd drawn kitchen duty through various combinations of assignment rotation and disciplinary action. They watched her with the casual curiosity that military personnel reserve for new leadership, sizing up whether she'd be the type to run a tight ship or let things slide into comfortable mediocrity. Private Jackson leaned against the prep counter, his sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms covered in tattoos that told stories of weekend liberty and questionable decisions. He was the type who'd learned to navigate military kitchens through charm and just enough competence to avoid serious trouble. "New head chef looks like somebody's grandmother," he muttered to Private Rodriguez, who was supposed to be checking inventory but was more interested in the entertainment value of fresh gossip. Rodriguez nodded with the wisdom of someone who'd seen enough rotating kitchen staff to consider himself an expert on the subject. "Bet she's one of those civilian contractors they bring in when they can't find anyone else. Probably learned to cook at some church potluck and thinks she can handle feeding 300 soldiers. Specialist Kim, a sharp-eyed woman from California, who'd been assigned to the mess hall for the past 6 months, looked up from her clipboard with the expression of someone who'd heard this conversation before. "Maybe give her a chance before you write her off?" Last 3 head chefs couldn't organize a soup line without creating chaos. Elena heard the conversation but didn't react. She'd spent enough time in military environments to know that new leadership always faced the same initial skepticism. Earning respect was a process that couldn't be rushed, and she'd learned long ago that action spoke louder than any amount of posturing or speeches. About how things were going to change. She moved to the main prep station and began her own inventory, checking supplies with the methodical precision that had once been applied to very different kinds of equipment. Her hands moved over ingredients with the same careful attention she'd once given to weapons maintenance, noting quality, quantity, and organization with the trained eye of someone who understood that preparation was everything. The kitchen staff continued their morning routine around her, but Elena could feel their attention like a physical weight. They were watching to see how she handled herself, whether she'd immediately start making changes or try to establish authority through intimidation. She'd seen both approaches fail spectacularly in other contexts, and she had no intention of repeating those mistakes. Private Davis, a kid from Montana who'd been working the breakfast shift for 2 weeks, approached with the mixture of respect and wariness, that junior enlisted personnel showed to anyone with authority. "Ma'am, where would you like me to start with the breakfast prep? Usually we get the eggs going first, then move to the bacon, but if you want to change the order." Elena turned to face him, and for just a moment, Davis caught something in her eyes that didn't quite match the grandmother image his fellow soldiers had been constructing. There was a depth there, a kind of focused attention that suggested someone who'd learned to assess situations quickly and thoroughly. But when she spoke, her voice carried the gentle patience of someone who understood that good teaching required time and respect. "What's your name, soldier?" "Private Davis, ma'am. Been working breakfast shift since I got here." "Tell me about your routine, Davis. Walk me through how you usually handle the morning prep." Davis straightened slightly, responding to the genuine interest in her voice. "Well, ma'am, we usually start around 0500 with the coffee and basic setup. Get the grills heated, check the steam tables, make sure everything's clean and ready. Then we start with proteins, usually eggs and bacon, since those take the longest and everyone expects them fresh." Elena nodded, absorbing the information without immediately offering corrections or suggestions. She'd learned that understanding existing systems was crucial before attempting to improve them. "How many people do you usually serve for breakfast?" "Depends on the day, ma'am. Weekdays are usually around 200, weekends are lighter. Maybe 150 on average." "And how long does it typically take you to serve that many?" Davis glanced toward his fellow kitchen staff, uncertain whether this was the beginning of a critique or genuine curiosity. "Usually about 2 hours from when we open the line, sometimes longer if we get backed up." Elena made a mental note, but kept her expression neutral. 2 hours to serve 200 people suggested some inefficiencies in workflow, but she'd need to observe the actual process before making any changes. Jumping to conclusions based on limited information had been a luxury she'd never been able to afford in her previous career. She moved to the walk-in cooler and began checking food supplies, her movements efficient and purposeful. The other soldiers watched her work, noting the way she handled herself with quiet confidence, but without any of the aggressive energy they'd learned to associate with military leadership. She seemed more like someone's mother checking a home kitchen than a head chef taking command of a military food service operation. "Think she's ever cooked for more than a church bake sale?" Jackson whispered to Rodriguez, who was now openly watching Elena's inspection routine. Rodriguez shrugged, but his expression suggested he was beginning to wonder if there might be more to the new chef than her appearance suggested. "She moves like she knows what she's doing. But knowing your way around a kitchen and running a military mess hall are two different things." Elena emerged from the cooler with a mental inventory of available ingredients and a growing understanding of the challenges she'd be facing. The food quality was adequate but uninspiring, the kind of institutional cooking that met nutritional requirements without any consideration for morale or satisfaction. She'd seen similar situations before, though in very different contexts. She looked around the kitchen, taking in the faces of soldiers who were waiting to see what kind of leader she'd prove to be. They were young mostly, with the kind of energy that could be channeled into excellence or allowed to drift into mediocrity depending on the guidance they received. Each one represented someone's son or daughter, someone who deserved better than the minimum effort that had apparently become the standard. The morning light was beginning to filter through the high windows, casting long shadows across the prep stations. In a few hours, hungry soldiers would be lining up for breakfast, expecting hot food and efficient service. Elena had 3 hours to assess her team, understand their capabilities, and begin the process of earning their respect. She'd faced longer odds with less time and fewer resources. But those days were supposed to be behind her now. This was meant to be the quiet assignment, the place where former operators went to finish out their careers in peace. She'd requested food service specifically because it seemed like the kind of work that would let her serve without the complications that had defined her previous Assignment stopped looking at the soldiers around her. Elena felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. They didn't know her story, didn't understand what she'd done before this assignment. And if she was successful, they'd never need to know. She'd simply be the chef who ran an efficient kitchen and made sure everyone got fed properly. That was the plan, anyway. But plans, Elena had learned, rarely survived contact with reality. The breakfast rush at Fort Meridian was controlled chaos, the kind of organized mayhem that separated functional military operations from complete disaster. Elena positioned herself at the central command station, watching the morning unfold with the analytical eye of someone who'd learned to read situations quickly and accurately. The serving line stretched from the kitchen doors to the far wall. A river of green uniforms moving with the practiced efficiency of people who'd learned that military meals were about fuel, not fine dining. Sergeant First Class Marcus Thompson ruled the serving line with the kind of aggressive authority that came from 15 years of dealing with hungry soldiers and impossible timelines. He was a stocky man with prematurely gray hair and the permanent scowl of someone who'd seen every possible way that food service could go wrong. His voice carried over the clatter of trays and the rumble of conversation, directing traffic with the precision of an air traffic controller managing rush hour at a major airport. Move it along, people. This ain't a restaurant, it's a chow line. Get your food and find a seat. Thompson's bark was practiced and efficient, the kind of crowd control that kept 300 soldiers fed and moving without creating bottlenecks or confusion. He'd been running the Fort Meridian mess hall for 3 years, and he'd developed systems that worked, even if they weren't particularly elegant. Elena watched him work, noting the way he managed flow and handled problems with the kind of instinctive efficiency that came from experience. But she also noticed the subtle signs of a system under strain. The serving line moved, but not smoothly. Soldiers waited longer than necessary for hot food, and the quality suffered from the rushed pace that Thompson's methods demanded. The kitchen staff moved around her with the practiced choreography of people who'd learned to work together under pressure. Private Jackson manned the grill with casual competence, flipping eggs and bacon with the rhythm of someone who'd found his groove and stuck with it. Rodriguez handled the steam tables, keeping serving dishes filled and rotated with the mechanical precision of someone who'd learned that consistency was more important than creativity. But Elena could see the gaps in their coordination, the small inefficiencies that accumulated over time into bigger problems. Jackson's grill technique was adequate, but produced uneven results. Rodriguez kept the steam tables full, but didn't pay attention to food quality, allowing some dishes to overcook while others remained undercooked. The entire operation ran on momentum rather than planning, reacting to problems instead of preventing them. The real test came when Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Wells entered the mess hall with the kind of presence that made junior officers check their appearance and senior NCOs straighten their shoulders. She was a career military officer with 22 years of service, the kind of leader who'd earned her rank through competence rather than politics. Her uniform was perfect, her bearing was professional, and her reputation for holding people accountable preceded her wherever she went. Wells approached the serving line with the measured pace of someone conducting an inspection, her eyes taking in details that most people would miss. The temperature of the food, the cleanliness of the serving surfaces, the efficiency of the line movement, the attitudes of the soldiers being served. She'd been responsible for base operations for 18 months, and she'd learned that food service was often the first indicator of broader organizational problems. Elena watched Wells work her way through the line, noting the way the lieutenant colonel interacted with the soldiers and assessed the operation. This was clearly someone who understood that leadership meant attention to detail and personal accountability. The kind of officer who would expect excellence and had the authority to demand it. Thompson had noticed Wells' arrival and was trying to manage the serving line with extra attention to protocol, but Elena could see the strain. The system that worked adequately under normal circumstances was showing its limitations under the pressure of official scrutiny. Soldiers were waiting longer for food, servers were making mistakes, and the overall quality of the operation was suffering. Wells reached the serving counter and accepted a tray from Private Davis, who was trying to balance speed with the kind of presentation that might impress a senior officer. The scrambled eggs were slightly overcooked, the bacon was unevenly crispy, and the toast was cooling toward room temperature. Not terrible, but not the kind of food that demonstrated pride in craft or attention to excellence. "Sergeant Thompson," Wells said, her voice carrying the kind of neutral tone that senior officers used when they were gathering information rather than making judgments. "How's the new head chef working out?" Thompson glanced toward Elena, who was standing near the prep station observing the morning rush. "Still getting her feet under her, ma'am. Early days, but she seems to know her way around a kitchen." Wells followed Thompson's gaze and studied Elena with the kind of assessment that senior officers applied to new personnel. What she saw was a middle-aged woman who moved with quiet confidence, but didn't project the kind of aggressive leadership that military kitchens typically required. Elena looked more like someone who'd be comfortable teaching cooking classes at a community center than managing the controlled chaos of feeding hundreds of soldiers under tight deadlines. "Previous experience?" Wells asked. "Civilian food service." "Ma'am, restaurant work, I believe." Wells nodded but didn't look entirely convinced. Military food service was different from civilian cooking, requiring different skills and a different approach to leadership. The stakes were higher, the timelines were tighter, and the margin for error was smaller. A head chef who couldn't adapt to military requirements would become a problem that Wells would need to solve quickly. Elena was close enough to hear the conversation, and she understood the subtext. Wells was evaluating her, trying to determine whether the new head chef would be an asset or a liability. The lieutenant colonel was professional enough not to make snap judgments, but Elena could see the skepticism in her expression. The breakfast rush continued around them, but Elena noticed that Wells' presence had changed the dynamic. Soldiers were more careful, servers were more attentive, and Thompson was managing the line with extra attention to detail. The kind of temporary improvement that came from official oversight, but didn't reflect the normal operating standards. Private Kim approached Elena with a clipboard full of inventory reports and supply requests, the kind of administrative work that kept military kitchens functioning, but rarely received much attention. "Ma'am, we're running low on several key ingredients. The distributor delivery is scheduled for Thursday, but we might need to adjust some menu items before then." Elena took the clipboard and reviewed the information, her mind automatically calculating alternatives and adjustments. She'd learned to work with limited resources before, though in very different circumstances. The skills transferred more easily than most people would expect. "What's our backup plan for protein if the delivery is delayed?" Elena asked. Kim looked surprised by the question. Most head chefs focused on the current day's menu and left contingency planning to the supply staff. "Usually we just make do with whatever's available, ma'am. Maybe switch to more rice and vegetables, stretch the meat further." Elena nodded, but she was already thinking about more creative solutions. Military food service didn't have to mean uninspiring food, and soldiers deserved better than the minimum effort that had apparently become the standard. But change would need to come gradually, and she'd need to earn her team's trust before she could implement significant improvements. The morning rush was reaching its peak, with soldiers moving through the line in steady waves. Elena watched the flow, noting bottlenecks and inefficiencies with the kind of analytical attention that had once been applied to very different kinds of operations. Every system had weaknesses, and understanding those weaknesses was the first step toward improvement. But she also understood that change would need to be earned, rather than imposed. The kitchen staff was watching her, testing her reactions, and trying to determine what kind of leader she'd prove to be. They'd worked with head chefs who came in making dramatic changes and demanding immediate results. And they'd learned to be skeptical of new leadership that promised transformation without understanding the existing challenges. Elena planned to be different. She'd learned patience in environments where impatience could be fatal, and she understood that sustainable change required building trust and demonstrating competence over time. The breakfast rush would end, and then she'd begin the real work of earning her team's respect and improving their operation. The stakes were lower than what she'd faced before, but the principles remained the same. Success required preparation, attention to detail, and the ability to adapt when circumstances changed. Elena had all of those skills, though her new team didn't know it yet. The afternoon lull in the mess hall brought out the worst in soldiers, who had too much time and too little supervision. Corporal Jake Morrison sat at the corner table nearest the kitchen doors, his chair tilted back against the wall with the casual arrogance of someone who'd appointed himself the unofficial commentator on base life. At 24, Morrison had enough service time to feel experienced and just enough rank to think his opinions mattered. His uniform was always just on the edge of regulation, clean enough to pass inspection, but worn with the kind of calculated carelessness that suggested he was too cool to care about military appearance standards. Morrison had been watching Elena through the service window for the past hour, documenting her every move with the dedication of someone who'd found a new source of entertainment. To him, she represented everything that was wrong with the military's current approach to personnel management. Too old, too soft, too civilian to understand what real military service required. "Look at her in there," Morrison said to his audience of junior enlisted soldiers who'd learned that laughing at his jokes was easier than finding somewhere else to sit, moving around like she's arranging flowers at a wedding. "This is supposed to be a military kitchen, not some community center." "Cooking class." Private First Class Danny Chun leaned forward with the eager attention of someone who'd found his place in the base social hierarchy by agreeing with whoever seemed most confident. Chun was new enough to the military that he still believed rank and attitude were the same thing, and Morrison's casual disrespect for authority figures seemed like sophisticated worldliness rather than simple immaturity. "She probably thinks seasoning salt is too spicy," Chun added, earning chuckles from the other soldiers at the table. "I bet she learned to cook from those daytime cooking shows where they spend 20 minutes explaining how to boil water." "Specialist." Rick Brennan nodded with the wisdom of someone who'd been assigned to kitchen duty twice and considered himself an expert on food service operations. Brennan was the type who had strong opinions about everything and the confidence to share them whether anyone asked or not. His permanent assignment to the mess hall had given him intimate knowledge of how military kitchens should operate, at least in theory. "What kills me," Brennan said, warming to the topic, "is that she's probably making more money than any of us, and for what? Standing around looking confused while the real soldiers do all the actual work. I guarantee she's never been in a situation where people's lives depended on her getting things right." Morrison's phone was discreetly positioned to capture video of Elena's movements through the service window, though he was careful to keep the recording subtle enough to avoid official attention. The footage would be perfect for the group chat he maintained with soldiers from his previous assignments, a running commentary on military life that helped him maintain his reputation as someone who saw through official nonsense. "Check this out," Morrison said, zooming in on Elena as she carefully arranged ingredients at the prep station. "She's treating every potato like it's a piece of fine crystal. We're feeding soldiers, not hosting a dinner party for foreign ambassadors." The criticism wasn't entirely unfair. Elena did approach her work with more care than the previous head chefs had shown, taking time to ensure proper preparation and presentation. But what Morrison and his friends saw as unnecessary fussiness was actually the habits of someone who'd learned that attention to detail could mean the difference between success and failure in environments where mistakes had permanent consequences. Private Luis Morales had been listening to the conversation with growing discomfort. As the youngest member of the group, he'd learned that staying quiet was usually safer than disagreeing with more senior soldiers. But something about the sustained mockery of Elena bothered him in ways he couldn't quite articulate. She'd been nothing but professional during their brief interactions, and the food quality had noticeably improved since her arrival. Maybe she's just trying to do a good job, Morales suggested quietly, immediately regretting speaking up when Morrison's attention focused on him like a laser. "Maybe you're just trying to kiss up to the new boss," Morrison replied with the kind of smile that wasn't friendly. "What's next, Morales? You going to volunteer for extra kitchen duty so you can learn her secret recipes?" The other soldiers laughed, and Morales felt his face flush with embarrassment. He'd learned another lesson about the dangers of defending people who weren't present to defend themselves, especially when those people were already targets for group mockery. Chun pulled out his own phone and began recording Elena through the service window, emboldened by Morrison's example. "This is going to be legendary content. Military chef who moves like she's afraid of her own shadow trying to feed actual warriors." The afternoon shift change brought fresh soldiers into the mess hall, and Morrison saw an opportunity to expand his audience. Sergeant Kevin Walsh entered with the purposeful stride of someone who'd finished his duty shift and was looking forward to a hot meal and some downtime. Walsh was a squad leader with 8 years of service, the kind of NCO who'd earned his rank through competence rather than politics. "Hey, Sergeant Walsh," Morrison called out. "Come check out our new culinary expert. She's revolutionizing military food service with her advanced techniques of moving really slowly and looking perpetually confused." Walsh approached the table with the mixture of curiosity and caution that experienced NCOs developed when junior soldiers wanted to share their opinions about leadership. He'd learned to listen without necessarily agreeing, gathering information while maintaining the kind of professional distance that his rank required. "What's the story?" Walsh asked, glancing toward the kitchen where Elena was visible through the service window. "New head chef," Brennan explained with the enthusiasm of someone sharing gossip. "Civilian contractor, probably learned everything she knows from cooking shows. Thompson's too polite to say anything, but you can tell he's not impressed." Walsh observed Elena for a moment, noting the way she moved with quiet efficiency and the improvements in food presentation that had been evident since her arrival. His experience with military food service was extensive enough to recognize competence when he saw it, even if it didn't match the aggressive leadership style that some soldiers expected. "Food's been better lately," Walsh said neutrally. Morrison waved dismissively. "That's because Thompson's been covering for her. Wait until she has to handle a real crisis. First time we get a rush order or supply shortage, she's going to fold like a cheap tent." The conversation continued around Elena's perceived inadequacies, with each soldier adding their own observations and predictions about her inevitable failure. They created a narrative in which she was fundamentally unsuited for military service, too soft for the demands of feeding soldiers, too old to adapt to military culture. What none of them knew was that Elena had heard every word. The service window provided excellent acoustics, and she'd developed the habit of listening to conversations that people thought were private. In her previous career, such intelligence had been invaluable for understanding group dynamics and identifying potential threats. She continued her work with the same methodical precision, giving no indication that she was aware of the ongoing commentary about her competence. The soldier's mockery told her everything she needed to know about the social dynamics she'd be navigating, and she filed the information away for future reference. Elena had been underestimated before, and she understood that changing people's minds required demonstration rather than argument. The soldiers at Morrison's table would learn eventually, though she hoped it would be through improved food service, rather than the kind of dramatic revelation that had characterized her previous assignments. The mess hall was supposed to be her quiet assignment, a place where she could serve without complications. But as she listened to the continued mockery from soldiers who had no idea what she'd done before this posting, Elena began to suspect that her past and present might not stay separated as easily as she'd hoped. The emergency order came through at 13:47 hours, delivered by a breathless private who'd clearly run from the administrative building to the mess hall kitchen. Elena read the printed requisition with the same calm attention she'd given to morning inventory reports, but the content was significantly more challenging. The base commander needed a full meal service for 87 visiting officers from 3 different allied nations. Dietary restrictions included. Ready for service at 1900 hours. Elena handed the order to Sergeant Thompson, who scanned it quickly, and then stared at her with the expression of someone who'd just been asked to perform magic. "Ma'am, with respect, this is impossible. We don't have the ingredients for international cuisine. We don't have the staff for formal service. And we sure as hell don't have the time to prepare something that won't embarrass the entire base." Through the service window, Morrison had noticed the sudden activity in the kitchen and was providing running commentary to his expanded audience. "Oh, this is perfect. Watch the new chef try to handle her first real crisis. I bet she's going to run straight to the base commander and explain why it can't be done." Elena studied the requisition more carefully, noting the specific dietary requirements and cultural considerations that would need to be addressed. 3 officers required halal preparation, 2 needed gluten-free options, and the French contingent would expect something approaching actual cuisine rather than institutional food service. Under normal circumstances, Thompson was right. The request was impossible. But Elena had learned to redefine impossible during her previous career. She moved to the ingredient storage area and began conducting a rapid inventory, her mind automatically calculating alternatives and substitutions. The base pantry wasn't designed for international cuisine, but it contained the basic components that could be transformed with the right techniques and proper preparation. Thompson, gather the entire kitchen staff. Everyone who's not actively serving the dinner line. Elena's voice carried a new authority that made the sergeant pause. This wasn't the gentle suggestion of someone asking for cooperation. This was the clear directive of someone who'd made a decision and expected it to be implemented. The kitchen staff assembled with varying degrees of enthusiasm and curiosity. Private Jackson approached the gathering with the casual attitude of someone who'd seen emergency orders before and learned that panic was usually more destructive than helpful. Rodriguez joined the group with obvious reluctance, clearly believing that the impossible request would end in failure and probably overtime duty. Private King stood at attention with the professional composure of someone who'd learned to adapt to changing circumstances, but even she looked skeptical about the timeline and requirements. Davis positioned himself where he could observe Elena's reaction to the crisis, curious to see whether she'd fold under pressure or reveal some hidden competence. Elena spread the requisition on the central prep table and began outlining her approach with the kind of methodical precision that suggested she'd handled similar challenges before. "We're going to modify our standard menu components to meet international standards. The key is proper seasoning, presentation, and understanding that the same ingredients can create very different impressions depending on preparation technique." Morrison leaned closer to the service window, his phone recording Elena's briefing with the anticipation of someone expecting to document a spectacular failure. "She's actually going to try it. This is going to be better than reality TV." Elena began assigning specific tasks with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to coordinate complex operations under tight deadlines. "Jackson, you're going to prepare the protein courses using standard ingredients, but with modified seasoning profiles. I'll walk you through the techniques. Rodriguez, you're handling vegetable preparation with attention to presentation standards that will meet international expectations. The assignments continued with increasing specificity and complexity. Elena was asking her team to execute techniques they'd never attempted, using ingredients in ways they'd never considered, all while maintaining the timeline that would normally be reserved for standard meal service. Kim, you're going to assist with the halal preparation protocols. This requires separate preparation areas and specific handling procedures that we'll need to implement immediately. Davis, you're responsible for gluten-free options using alternative ingredients that will maintain nutritional standards while meeting dietary restrictions. Thompson watched Elena's coordination with growing amazement. She was transforming an impossible request into a series of manageable tasks, each one building on the others to create a comprehensive solution. The approach was professional, efficient, and demonstrated a level of kitchen management that he'd never seen from previous head chefs. Elena moved to the spice storage and began selecting seasonings with the precision of someone who understood exactly how different combinations would affect flavor profiles. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, measuring and combining ingredients in ways that suggested extensive experience with international cuisine. "Ma'am," Thompson said quietly, "where exactly did you learn to coordinate this kind of operation?" Elena glanced up from her seasoning preparation, meeting his gaze with steady eyes that carried a depth Thompson was just beginning to recognize. Different context, same principles. Complex operations succeed through proper planning, clear communication, and team coordination. The response didn't really answer his question, but something in Elena's tone suggested that pressing for details might not be appropriate. Thompson had enough experience with military personnel to recognize when someone was deflecting questions about their background, and he'd learned that such deflection usually had good reasons. The kitchen staff began their assigned tasks with the mixture of professionalism and skepticism that characterized military response to challenging orders. They'd follow Elena's instructions, but they weren't entirely convinced that her approach would succeed. The timeline was tight, the requirements were complex, and the stakes were higher than normal meal service. Elena moved between stations with the fluid efficiency of someone conducting a complex operation, providing guidance and making adjustments with the kind of real-time decision-making that kept complicated plans on track. Her instructions were clear, her expectations were reasonable, and her confidence was beginning to affect the entire team's attitude toward the impossible request. Private Jackson found himself following Elena's seasoning instructions with growing interest. The techniques she was teaching him were simple but effective, transforming standard ingredients into something approaching actual cuisine. "Ma'am, how do you know that this combination will work with the protein preparation?" Elena demonstrated the technique with movements that were economical and precise, her hands working with the kind of muscle memory that came from extensive practice. Flavor profiles are consistent regardless of context. The key is understanding how different ingredients interact and using that knowledge to create the results you need. Morrison was still recording through the service window, but his commentary had become less confident. Elena's coordination of the emergency order wasn't providing the spectacular failure he'd expected. Instead, she was demonstrating competence that didn't match the narrative he'd been constructing about her inadequacy. "She's actually making it work," Chun observed with surprise. "I didn't think it was possible to pull this off with our regular ingredients." Morrison adjusted his phone angle to capture Elena's movements as she moved between preparation stations, but he was beginning to suspect that the footage might not be as entertaining as he'd anticipated. Elena wasn't failing dramatically. She was succeeding methodically, and her success was making his mockery look increasingly foolish. The kitchen had transformed into a precisely coordinated operation, with each team member executing their assigned tasks while Elena maintained oversight and made real-time adjustments. The impossible request was becoming achievable through proper planning and skilled execution. Elena checked the timeline and made final adjustments to the preparation schedule, her mind calculating the coordination required to have all components ready simultaneously. The operation was complex, but it was working, and her team was beginning to understand that their new head chef might have capabilities they'd never suspected. The emergency dinner preparation had reached its critical phase, with all stations operating at maximum efficiency under Elena's coordination. The kitchen hummed with the kind of focused activity that came from clear leadership and precise timing. Steam rose from multiple cooking surfaces, the air filled with the complex aromas of international cuisine being crafted from standard military ingredients. Elena moved to the knife station to begin the final vegetable preparation, a task that required speed and precision to meet the approaching deadline. The base knife set was institutional quality, designed for durability rather than performance, but she selected an 8-inch chef's knife with the care of someone who understood that tools were extensions of skill rather than replacements for it. Private Davis was stationed nearby, working on garnish preparation when Elena began her cutting technique. What he saw made him pause in his own work and watch with growing fascination. Elena's knife work was unlike anything he'd witnessed in military kitchens or civilian restaurants. Her movements were fluid, economical, and possessed a rhythm that suggested extensive training in environments where efficiency wasn't just preferred but essential. She worked through a pile of onions with mechanical precision, each cut identical to the last, producing uniform pieces at a speed that seemed impossible. The knife never paused, never hesitated, moving in a continuous flow that transformed vegetables into precisely sized components. Her left hand guided the ingredients with fingers positioned in a way that kept them safe while maintaining perfect control over the cutting process. "Ma'am," Davis said quietly, his voice carrying genuine admiration, "where did you learn to cut like that?" Elena glanced up briefly, her hands never stopping their work. "Practice," she replied simply, but Davis noticed something in her grip and stance that didn't match typical culinary training. There was an edge to her technique, a sharpness that suggested the knife had been used for more than food preparation. Rodriguez had abandoned his own station to observe Elena's knife work, drawn by the hypnotic efficiency of her movements. "I've never seen anyone cut vegetables that fast without taking off their fingers," he said with the wonder of someone watching a master craftsman demonstrate their art. Elena's technique was indeed impressive, but what the soldiers couldn't see was the tactical awareness that accompanied her knife work. She maintained complete situational awareness of everyone in the kitchen, tracking movement and positions with the peripheral vision of someone who'd learned that inattention could be fatal. Her body position kept the knife between herself and potential threats, and her grip could transition from culinary tool to defensive weapon without conscious thought. The cutting board became a blur of motion as Elena worked through carrots, celery, and peppers with the same mechanical precision. Each vegetable was reduced to identical pieces in seconds, creating uniform components that would cook evenly and present properly. The pile of prepared ingredients grew with mathematical regularity, each piece cut to specifications that would have impressed professional chefs. Staff Sergeant Thompson approached the cutting station with the clipboard containing final preparation notes, but he found himself distracted by Elena's knife work. He'd supervised military kitchens for 15 years and had never witnessed technique that approached this level of efficiency. "Ma'am, that's some serious skill you've got there." Elena set down the knife and wiped her hands on her apron, the motion practiced and automatic. Different tools, same principles. Speed comes from repetition. Precision comes from understanding your equipment. Thompson nodded, but something in her response suggested deeper meaning. The way she referred to different tools implied familiarity with implements beyond kitchen knives, and her casual mention of understanding your equipment carried the weight of someone who'd learned that lesson in context where mistakes had permanent consequences. Private Kim had been watching from the prep station, noting not just Elena's knife work, but the way she positioned herself in the kitchen. Elena never turned her back to the main entrance, always maintained clear sight lines to all access points, and kept her cutting station positioned where she could observe the entire kitchen without appearing to do so. "She moves like she's expecting trouble," Kim murmured to Davis, who was still fascinated by Elena's cutting technique. Davis nodded, though he hadn't consciously registered the tactical elements of Elena's positioning. "There's something different about her. The way she handles herself, the way she coordinates everything. It's like she's done this before, but not just cooking." The observation was more accurate than Davis realized. Elena had indeed coordinated complex operations under pressure, though. The context had been significantly different from food service. The skills transferred more easily than most people would expect. Leadership, timing, resource management, and the ability to maintain calm under pressure were universal requirements for success in high-stakes environments. Elena began the final seasoning process, tasting each component with the methodical precision of someone who understood that small errors could compound into major failures. Her palate was trained to detect subtle variations in flavor and texture, a skill that had been developed through extensive practice in environments where attention to detail was critical. Morrison had maintained his position at the service window, recording Elena's emergency dinner coordination with decreasing confidence in his original assessment. The footage showed competence rather than failure, efficiency rather than confusion. Elena wasn't providing the entertainment he'd expected, and his commentary had become increasingly forced. "She's not bad with a knife," Chun admitted grudgingly, watching Elena's continued preparation work. "But knife skills don't make you a military chef. Wait until she has to handle real pressure." Morrison adjusted his phone to capture Elena's movements as she transitioned between stations, but he was beginning to suspect that his documentation might not support the narrative he'd been constructing. Elena's coordination of the impossible dinner request was succeeding, and her team was responding with increasing respect and efficiency. The kitchen had become a precisely orchestrated operation, with each team member executing their assignments while Elena maintained oversight and quality control. The emergency order was approaching completion ahead of schedule, and the food quality exceeded anything the mess hall had produced in recent memory. Elena checked the main preparation timeline and made final adjustments to the service schedule, her mind calculating the coordination required to have all components ready simultaneously. The operation was complex, but it was working, and her team was beginning to understand that their new head chef possessed capabilities that extended far beyond standard culinary training. Private Jackson approached Elena with a question about final presentation standards, but found himself studying her hands as she demonstrated proper plating technique. There were small scars on her knuckles and fingers, the kind of marks that came from extensive training with sharp instruments in environments where safety wasn't the primary concern. Elena noticed Jackson's attention and pulled down her sleeves slightly, a subtle gesture that covered the scars without drawing attention to the movement. The action was automatic, practiced, the kind of concealment that came from long experience with hiding, evidence of activities that weren't meant for public knowledge. The emergency dinner was entering its final phase, with all components prepared and ready for service. Elena had transformed an impossible request into a successful operation through skilled coordination and professional execution. But the soldiers who'd observed her work were beginning to realize that their new head chef possessed training and experience that extended far beyond civilian food service. The questions would come later, when the immediate crisis was resolved, and there was time to consider the implications of what they'd witnessed. For now, Elena had succeeded in meeting the impossible deadline while maintaining the kind of quality standards that would reflect well on the entire base. The international dinner service had concluded with remarkable success, earning compliments from the visiting officers and a rare expression of satisfaction from the base commander. Elena had transformed an impossible request into a diplomatic victory, demonstrating coordination skills that impressed even the most skeptical observers. The kitchen staff had worked with unprecedented efficiency, and the final presentation had exceeded all expectations for a military food service operation. But success, Elena had learned, didn't always translate to respect. As the cleanup process began and the immediate crisis faded into memory, some soldiers seemed determined to minimize her achievement and find new angles for criticism. Morrison led this effort with the persistence of someone who'd invested too much credibility in his original assessment to admit error. Anyone could have pulled that off with enough advance notice, Morrison declared to his assembled audience in the mess hall the following morning. His phone was positioned to capture Elena's routine breakfast preparation, building what he planned to be a comprehensive documentation of her inadequacy. She just got lucky that Thompson and the regular kitchen staff did all the real work. The assertion required willful ignorance of what the soldiers had actually witnessed, but Morrison delivered it with the confidence of someone who decided that facts were less important than maintaining his narrative. His audience had grown to include soldiers from other units who'd heard about the international dinner and were curious about the new head chef who'd somehow managed to impress senior officers. Specialist Torres from the motor pool had joined Morrison's regular table, drawn by the entertainment value of mess hall gossip and the opportunity to participate in the kind of casual mockery that helped pass time during slow periods. I heard she just followed recipes from some cookbook. Nothing special about that. My grandmother could have done the same thing. Private Chun nodded eagerly, his loyalty to Morrison's perspective unwavering despite the evidence of Elena's competence. The whole thing was probably planned in advance. Base Command probably warned her days ago, and she just pretended it was emergency orders to make herself look good. The theory was creative but completely unfounded, requiring belief in a conspiracy that would involve multiple levels of military hierarchy. But it allowed Morrison's group to maintain their dismissive attitude while acknowledging Elena's apparent success. The mental gymnastics required to sustain this position would have been impressive if they'd been applied to more productive purposes. Elena moved through her morning routine with the same methodical precision she'd shown since arriving at Fort Meridian, giving no indication that she was aware of the ongoing commentary about her competence. But the service window provided excellent acoustics, and she'd heard every word of the soldiers' increasingly desperate attempts to minimize her achievement. The breakfast rush proceeded with improved efficiency, a direct result of the coordination techniques Elena had implemented during the emergency dinner preparation. The kitchen staff had learned to work together more effectively, and the food quality had risen to standards that impressed even regular customers who'd grown accustomed to institutional mediocrity. But Morrison was determined to find fault with Elena's performance, and he focused his attention on aspects of her work that he believed would support his predetermined conclusions. Look at how slow she moves during routine service. She probably can't handle real pressure when it matters. That dinner thing was just a fluke. The criticism was becoming increasingly absurd, but Morrison delivered it with the conviction of someone who decided that admitting error was worse than maintaining obvious falsehoods. His phone captured Elena's measured movements as she supervised breakfast preparation, and he provided running commentary that portrayed efficiency as laziness and competence as luck. Sergeant Walsh observed Morrison's continued mockery with growing irritation. As an experienced NCO, he'd learned to recognize competence when he saw it, and Elena's coordination of the emergency dinner had demonstrated leadership skills that impressed professional soldiers. Morrison's refusal to acknowledge her success was beginning to reflect poorly on the entire group. "Morrison, give it a rest," Walsh said with the authority of someone who'd earned the right to shut down unproductive conversations. She delivered when it mattered. That's what counts in this business. But Morrison was too invested in his position to accept correction from a senior NCO. His response carried the defensive edge of someone who'd been challenged on territory he considered his own. "With respect, Sergeant, you weren't in the kitchen watching her work." "I was. She's not military material, and pretending otherwise doesn't change the facts." The assertion was bold enough to create uncomfortable silence among the soldiers who'd actually witnessed Elena's performance during the emergency dinner. Morrison was asking them to ignore their own observations in favor of his predetermined narrative, and the request was beginning to strain the credibility he'd built through months of successful mess hall commentary. Elena finished her breakfast preparation and moved to the inventory station, where she began reviewing supply reports with the same attention to detail she'd shown during the emergency dinner coordination. Her movements were economical and precise, suggesting someone who'd learned to work efficiently in environments where wasted motion could have serious consequences. Private Davis approached Elena with questions about the morning's menu modifications, but found himself studying her hands as she reviewed the paperwork. The scars he'd noticed during her knife work were visible again, small marks that suggested extensive training with sharp instruments and context that went beyond culinary preparation. Elena noticed Davis's attention and adjusted her sleeves slightly, a subtle gesture that covered the scars without drawing attention to the movement. The action was automatic, practiced, the kind of concealment that came from long experience with hiding evidence of activities that weren't meant for public knowledge. Morrison had positioned himself to capture Elena's interaction with Davis, hoping to document what he expected would be evidence of her inadequacy in routine operations. But the footage showed professional competence rather than failure, and Elena's coordination of routine breakfast service demonstrated the same efficiency she'd shown during the emergency dinner preparation. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The morning rush continued with improved flow and quality, direct results of Elena's leadership that were visible to anyone willing to acknowledge them. But Morrison's group had committed to their dismissive narrative, and they found increasingly creative ways to minimize Elena's obvious contributions to the mess hall's improved performance. "She's probably just following instructions left by the previous head chef," suggested Torres with the confidence of someone who'd never worked in a military kitchen. "Anyone can follow a recipe if they have enough time and help." Shun added his own theory with equal conviction. "The whole thing's probably micromanaged by Thompson. She just stands there looking official while the real soldiers do all the actual work." The theories required increasingly elaborate explanations to maintain consistency with observed reality, but Morrison's group seemed willing to construct whatever narrative was necessary to avoid admitting they'd misjudged Elena's capabilities. Their mockery had become more desperate and less credible, but it had also become more public and more documented. Elena continued her work with professional composure, but the soldiers who'd observed her performance during the emergency dinner were beginning to understand that their new head chef possessed training and experience that extended far beyond civilian food service. The questions would come eventually, when the immediate mockery faded and there was time to consider the implications of what they'd witnessed. The morning inventory routine had taken on a different quality since Elena's arrival, with supply management becoming an exercise in precision rather than approximation. She stood at the storage room entrance, clipboard in hand, conducting her weekly assessment with the methodical thoroughness that had become her trademark. Each item was counted, condition assessed, and expiration dates noted with the kind of attention to detail that transformed routine administrative work into comprehensive intelligence gathering. Master Sergeant Patricia Reeves had been approaching the mess hall with the intention of grabbing coffee and reviewing maintenance schedules, but something about Elena's posture made her pause. Reeves had spent 18 years in military intelligence, with deployments that had taken her to places where situational awareness meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. She'd developed an instinct for recognizing People who'd been trained in environments where attention to detail wasn't just professional courtesy, but survival necessity. Elena's positioning at the storage room entrance wasn't casual. She'd chosen a location that provided clear sight lines to all access points while maintaining cover from potential threats. Her clipboard was held in a way that allowed rapid transition to defensive positioning, and her stance suggested someone who'd learned to maintain readiness while appearing completely relaxed. Reeves had seen this kind of tactical awareness before, but never in military food service personnel. Elena moved with the unconscious efficiency of someone who'd been trained for operations that required constant vigilance and instant reaction to changing circumstances. The combination of professional competence and tactical positioning was distinctive, enough to trigger recognition in someone who'd worked with special operations personnel. "Excuse me," Reeves said, approaching Elena with the measured pace of someone who'd learned to read situations carefully before committing to action. "I'm Master Sergeant Reeves from Intelligence. Mind if I ask you a few questions?" Elena looked up from her clipboard, meeting Reeves' gaze with steady eyes that carried no surprise at being approached by senior personnel. Her response was professional, but neutral, the kind of acknowledgement that provided courtesy without offering information. "Of course, Master Sergeant. How can I help you?" The response was perfectly appropriate, but Reeves noticed subtleties that most people would miss. Elena's body language remained relaxed but ready. Her positioning kept the clipboard between herself and potential threats, and her tone carried the controlled neutrality of someone who'd learned that providing minimal information was safer than volunteering details. "I've been hearing good things about the improvements in food service since you arrived," Reeves continued, studying Elena's reactions with the trained observation skills that had made her effective in intelligence work. "The international dinner last week was particularly impressive. That kind of coordination under pressure suggests extensive experience with complex operations." Elena's expression didn't change, but Reeves caught a momentary stillness that suggested the comment had hit closer to accuracy than Elena was comfortable acknowledging. "Just applied standard management principles to food service. Clear communication, proper planning, team coordination." The deflection was smooth and professional, but it raised more questions than it answered. Reeves had interviewed enough people to recognize when someone was providing carefully constructed responses designed to discourage further inquiry. Elena's answer was accurate but incomplete, the kind of truth that concealed more than it revealed. "Standard management principles," Reeves repeated thoughtfully. "What kind of background gave you experience with that level of operational coordination?" Elena's pause was barely perceptible, but Reeves caught it. The question had touched on territory that Elena preferred not to discuss, and her response would be carefully calculated to provide sufficient information without revealing details that might be problematic. "Restaurant management," Elena said simply. "High-volume operations with demanding customers and tight deadlines. The skills transfer more easily than most people expect." Reeves nodded, but her intelligence training made her skeptical of explanations. That seemed too convenient. Restaurant management might explain Elena's culinary competence, but it didn't account for the tactical awareness and situational positioning that Reeves had observed. Those skills came from different training, in environments where the stakes were higher than customer satisfaction. Morrison had noticed the conversation between Elena and the Master Sergeant, and he'd positioned himself to capture the interaction with his phone. This was potentially perfect content for his documentation of Elena's inadequacy, especially if the intelligence NCO was questioning her credentials or competence. "Look at this," Morrison whispered to his assembled audience. "Intelligence is checking her out. I bet they're finally going to expose her for the fraud she really is." But Chun had been watching the conversation with growing uncertainty. The Master Sergeant's body language didn't suggest criticism or investigation. Instead, Reeves seemed to be studying Elena with the kind of professional interest that suggested recognition rather than suspicion. Reeves was indeed recognizing patterns that her intelligence training had taught her to identify. Elena's positioning, her situational awareness, and her deflection techniques were consistent with someone who'd received specialized training in environments where operational security was critical. The combination of skills was distinctive enough to narrow the possibilities significantly. Elena Vasquez, Reeves said quietly, testing the name against her memory of classified personnel files she'd reviewed during previous assignments. That name sounds familiar. Have we worked together before? Elena's stillness became more pronounced, and Reeves knew she'd touched on something significant. The question had triggered the kind of recognition that Elena had been working to avoid, and her response would either confirm or deny Reeves' growing suspicions about her background. "I don't believe so," Elena replied carefully. "I would remember working with someone from intelligence." The response was technically accurate but evasive, and Reeves recognized the tactical deflection. Elena was neither confirming nor denying previous military service, but her careful phrasing suggested familiarity with the kind of precise language that characterized classified operations. Reeves made a mental note to review her intelligence files for references to Elena Vasquez, particularly in contexts that might explain her tactical awareness and operational competence. The combination of culinary skills and tactical positioning was unusual enough to be memorable, especially if Elena had worked in environments where those skills would be relevant. "Well," Reeves said, her tone suggesting the conversation was concluding, but her interest was far from satisfied. "Keep up the excellent work. The improvements in food service haven't gone unnoticed by senior leadership." Elena nodded professionally, but Reeves noticed the slight relaxation in her posture that suggested relief at the conversation's apparent conclusion. The reaction confirmed Reeves' suspicion that Elena was concealing information about her background, and it provided direction for her intended file review. As Reeves walked away, she was already planning her research into Elena's history. The intelligence files would contain information that wasn't available through standard personnel records, and she had the clearance necessary to access classified materials that might explain Elena's unusual skill set. Elena returned to her inventory. Work with the same methodical precision, but Morrison's group had noticed the interaction and was already speculating about its implications. The Master Sergeant's professional interest in Elena didn't match their narrative of incompetence, and they were struggling to reconcile their observations with their predetermined conclusions. The conversation had lasted only minutes, but it had set in motion a process that would eventually reveal information that Elena had been working to keep private. Reeves had the knowledge, experience, and access necessary to uncover the truth about Elena's background, and her intelligence training made her persistent in pursuing answers to questions that others might abandon. Master Sergeant Reeves had spent the better part of 3 hours reviewing classified personnel files in the intelligence office, her access credentials allowing her to dig through layers of redacted information that most base personnel would never see. The secure terminal hummed quietly in the windowless room, its screen displaying fragments of operational histories that painted pictures of careers most people couldn't imagine. Elena Vasquez's file was extensive but heavily redacted, with black bars covering sections that contained information beyond Reeves' clearance level. What remained visible was enough to make her lean back in her chair and reassess everything she thought she knew about the quiet woman running the mess hall kitchen. Military, occupational specialty, 35S, collector analyst. But the operational assignments told a different story. Deployments to locations that didn't officially exist, attached to units whose designations were classified above Reeves' access level. The pattern was unmistakable to someone with intelligence training. Elena hadn't been analyzing intelligence from behind a desk. She'd been gathering it in the field, in places where collection meant infiltration and analysis meant survival. The commendation section contained references to operations that Reeves recognized. From classified briefings, Elena had been involved in some of the most sensitive missions conducted in the past 2 decades, operations that required skills far beyond traditional military training. The specific details were redacted, but the pattern was clear enough to someone who understood how special operations were documented. Reeves found herself staring at a service record that explained everything she'd observed about Elena's positioning, her tactical awareness, and her deflection techniques. This wasn't a civilian contractor who'd learned to cook in restaurants. This was an operator who'd spent years in environments where the wrong move could compromise missions and endanger lives. The medical section contained references to injuries that were consistent with combat operations, though the specific circumstances were classified. Elena had been wounded seriously enough to require extended medical leave, and her eventual reassignment to food service suggested a career transition that prioritized safety over operational effectiveness. But the most significant entry was buried in the assignment history, a single line that made Reeves pause and read it 3 times to ensure she'd understood correctly. Elena had been assigned to the Joint Special Operations Command's most classified unit, a designation that carried implications most people couldn't begin to comprehend. Reeves printed the portions of the file that her clearance level permitted, knowing that she needed to share this information with someone who could appreciate its significance. Elena Vasquez wasn't just a veteran who'd transitioned to civilian food service. She was someone who'd operated at the highest levels of classified military operations, and her assignment to Fort Meridian represented a significant career transition that deserved recognition rather than mockery. The walk from the intelligence office to the mess hall gave Reeves time to consider how to handle the information she'd discovered. Elena's file contained warnings about operational security that suggested her identity and background needed to be protected even in military environments. But the base personnel who'd been dismissing her competence deserved to understand who they were dealing with. The lunch rush was in full swing when Reeves entered the mess hall, with soldiers moving through the serving line with the efficient rhythm that had become standard since Elena's arrival. The food quality had improved dramatically, and the service flow reflected the kind of organizational efficiency that came from skilled leadership. Morrison was occupying his usual table, providing commentary about Elena's performance to his assembled audience of junior soldiers. His phone was positioned to capture what he expected would be evidence of Elena's inadequacy during routine operations, and his voice carried the confident tone of someone who'd appointed himself an expert on military food service. "I'm telling you, she's not military material," Morrison was saying as Reeves approached the table. "Look at how she moves around in there. No sense of urgency, no real understanding of what military service requires." Reeves had heard enough criticism based on ignorance to last several lifetimes, and Morrison's confident assessment of Elena's inadequacy was particularly offensive given what she just learned about Elena's actual background. The intelligence file had revealed a service record that would humble most soldiers, including Morrison and his followers. "Private Morrison," Reeves said, her voice carrying the authority that came from 18 years of military service and access to information that most people couldn't imagine. "I need you to stop talking and start listening." Morrison looked up with the mixture of surprise and concern that junior enlisted personnel showed when senior NCOs addressed them directly. His phone recording continued, but his attention was focused on Reeves with the kind of concentration that suggested he understood the seriousness of the situation. "That woman you've been mocking," Reeves continued, her voice loud enough to carry to the surrounding tables, "has a service record that would make most of us look like amateurs. Elena Vasquez isn't some civilian contractor who learned to cook in restaurants. She's a decorated veteran who served in environments most of us can't imagine." The assertion created immediate silence among the soldiers who'd been listening to Morrison's commentary. and Reeves could see the recognition beginning to dawn in their expressions. The competence they'd witnessed during the emergency dinner hadn't been luck or civilian training. It had been the result of skills developed in contexts where mistakes had permanent consequences. "Master Sergeant," Morrison said carefully, his confidence evaporating as he recognized the implications of Reeves' statement. "Are you saying she's military?" "I'm saying she's more military than most of us will ever be," Reeves replied with the conviction of someone who'd reviewed classified files and understood their significance. "Her operational record is classified above my clearance level, but what I can tell you is that she's earned respect through service that most of us couldn't handle." The mess hall had gone quiet around them, with soldiers at nearby tables stopping their conversations to listen to the exchange. Elena was visible through the service window, continuing her work with the same professional composure she'd maintained throughout the weeks of mockery. Apparently unaware of the conversation that was changing how people perceived her, Chun looked toward the kitchen with dawning understanding, his previous dismissal of Elena's competence being replaced by recognition of his own ignorance. "We didn't know," he said quietly, his voice carrying the shame of someone who'd realized they'd been wrong about something important. "You didn't know because you didn't ask," Reeves replied. "You made assumptions based on appearance and decided that was enough information to form opinions about someone's worth." The criticism was accurate and deserved, but it also carried the weight of broader lesson about respect and recognition. Elena's service record was classified, but her competence had been visible to anyone willing to look beyond surface appearances and preconceived notions. Morrison had stopped recording and was staring toward the kitchen with the expression of someone who just realized they'd been documenting their own ignorance rather than someone else's inadequacy. The footage he'd captured would serve as evidence of his failure to recognize competence rather than proof of Elena's shortcomings. The revelation of Elena's classified background spread through Fort Meridian with the speed that only military gossip could achieve. Within hours of Reeves' confrontation with Morrison, soldiers throughout the base were reassessing their assumptions about the quiet woman who'd been running the mess hall kitchen with methodical precision. The story grew with each telling, but the core truth remained consistent. Elena Vasquez was not the civilian contractor they'd believed her to be. Lieutenant Colonel Wells received the information through official channels, with Master Sergeant Reeves providing a briefing that highlighted Elena's operational background and the security considerations that surrounded her assignment. The classified nature of Elena's service record meant that details couldn't be shared broadly, but Wells understood the implications well enough to recognize that she'd been underestimating one of her most valuable personnel. "Why wasn't I informed about her background during the initial assignment process?" Wells asked, reviewing the limited information that Reeves could share without violating security protocols. "Standard operational security, ma'am," Reeves replied. "Personnel with her background are typically assigned undercover identities that don't reflect their actual service history. The goal is to allow them to transition to civilian-oriented roles without the complications that come with their operational history." Wells nodded, understanding the logic but frustrated by the communication gap that had led to Elena being undervalued by base personnel. The mockery and dismissal that Elena had endured weren't just disrespectful to an individual soldier. They represented a failure to recognize and properly utilize someone whose skills and experience could benefit the entire installation. The afternoon shift brought a different atmosphere to the mess hall, with soldiers approaching Elena's kitchen with the mixture of curiosity and respect that replaced their previous casual dismissal. The change wasn't dramatic enough to be obvious to someone who hadn't been observing the base dynamics, but Elena noticed the subtle shifts in behavior that indicated her status had somehow changed. Private Davis approached the service window with the kind of formal courtesy that suggested he'd learned something significant about Elena's background. His earlier casual interactions were replaced by the respectful professionalism that junior soldiers showed to senior personnel whose experience commanded recognition. "Ma'am," Davis said, his voice carrying new deference, "is there anything specific you'd like me to focus on during the dinner prep? I want to make sure I'm meeting your standards." Elena looked up from her inventory work, studying Davis with the same steady attention she'd given to all personnel interactions since arriving at Fort Meridian. The change in his demeanor was obvious enough to suggest that information about her background had begun circulating, though she wasn't certain about the specifics or the source. "Same standards as always, Davis," Elena replied evenly. "Attention to detail, proper preparation, teamwork. Nothing's changed about what we're trying to accomplish here." But Davis's reaction suggested that everything had changed about how the kitchen staff perceived their head chef. The respectful attention he showed Elena was being mirrored by other soldiers throughout the mess hall, creating an atmosphere that acknowledged her authority in ways that hadn't existed during her first weeks at the base. Sergeant Thompson had received his own briefing from Master Sergeant Reeves with enough classified information to understand why Elena's coordination of the emergency dinner had been so impressively efficient. The tactical skills and operational awareness that Thompson had observed weren't the result of civilian restaurant experience. They were the product of training in environments where precision and coordination were matters of survival. "Ma'am," Thompson said, approaching Elena with the formal respect that senior NCOs showed to personnel whose background commanded recognition, "I wanted to apologize for not recognizing your qualifications earlier. If I'd understood your background, I would have approached our working relationship differently." Elena's expression remained neutral, but Thompson caught a slight stiffness that suggested his apology had touched on sensitive territory. She'd clearly been hoping to avoid the kind of attention that came with recognition of her operational background, and Thompson's acknowledgement indicated that her cover assignment had been compromised. "No apology necessary, Sergeant," Elena replied carefully. "I'm here to do a job, not to receive recognition for previous assignments." The response was professional but carried undertones that suggested Elena was uncomfortable with the attention her background was generating. Thompson understood that personnel with classified operational histories often preferred anonymity, and Elena's reaction indicated that she'd been hoping to maintain the civilian contractor identity that had initially defined her assignment. But the base personnel who'd learned about Elena's background weren't prepared to ignore information that recontextualized everything they'd observed about her competence and professionalism. The mockery that had characterized her first weeks was being replaced by the kind of respectful recognition that her service record deserved. Morrison had been notably absent from the mess hall since his confrontation with Master Sergeant Reeves. Avoiding the location where his documented mockery of Elena would remind everyone of his failure to recognize her qualifications. The footage he'd captured with his phone had become evidence of his own ignorance rather than proof of Elena's inadequacy. Private Chun approached Elena during the evening cleanup with the kind of formal apology that suggested he'd been coached on appropriate protocol for addressing someone whose background he'd misunderstood. His earlier participation in Morrison's mockery had been replaced by obvious embarrassment about his role in dismissing Elena's competence. "Ma'am," Chun said, his voice carrying the careful respect of someone who'd learned that assumptions could be dangerous, "I want to apologize for my behavior during your first weeks here. I didn't understand your background, and I said things that were disrespectful and inappropriate." Elena paused in her cleaning routine, studying Chun with the same measured attention she'd shown to all personnel interactions. The apology was sincere, but it also confirmed that information about her background had spread throughout the base in ways that she'd been hoping to avoid. "Apology accepted," Elena replied simply. "But remember that respect should be given based on professionalism and competence, not on background information that might not be available." The response was characteristic of Elena's approach to leadership, focused on principles rather than personal recognition. Chun nodded with the understanding of someone who'd learned a valuable lesson about making assumptions and the importance of treating all personnel with professional courtesy regardless of their apparent background. The evening shift brought Colonel Hartwell to the mess hall, his presence indicating that Elena's background had been reported through official channels to the base command structure. Hartwell was a career officer with enough experience to understand the significance of having someone with Elena's operational history assigned to his installation. "Ms. Vasquez," Hartwell said, approaching Elena with the formal courtesy that senior officers showed to personnel whose service record commanded respect. "I understand we've been failing to properly recognize your qualifications. I'd like to discuss how we can better utilize your skills and experience." Elena's response was carefully neutral, but Hartwell could see the reluctance in her expression that suggested she'd been hoping to avoid the kind of attention that came with recognition of her operational background. The attack came during the evening dinner service, when the mess hall was filled with soldiers and the kitchen staff was focused on maintaining the efficient flow that had become Elena's trademark. 3 men entered through the main entrance with the purposeful stride of people who belonged, their civilian clothes and visitor badges creating no immediate alarm among the soldiers who glanced in their direction. Elena noticed them immediately, her tactical awareness triggering recognition of movement patterns that didn't match casual visitors. The men positioned themselves with the kind of coordination that suggested military training, and their positioning covered exit routes in ways that weren't coincidental. She continued her food preparation while tracking their movements through peripheral vision, her hands never pausing in their work. The first indication of trouble came when the lead man produced a compact submachine gun from beneath his jacket, his movements fluid and practiced. The weapon appeared with the kind of efficiency that suggested extensive training, and his positioning indicated familiarity with assault tactics that went beyond amateur capability. "Nobody move," he announced, his voice carrying the controlled authority of someone who'd planned this operation carefully. "This is a targeted action. Cooperation will keep everyone safe." The mess hall erupted in the kind of controlled chaos that came from soldiers recognizing a genuine threat. Tables overturned as personnel sought cover, and the trained responses that came from military conditioning took over. But the attackers had positioned themselves to control the room, and their coordination suggested they'd studied the layout and prepared for military response. Elena's reaction was immediate and instinctive. She dropped below the prep counter, her hand automatically reaching for the ceramic ladle that had been her constant companion during food preparation. The kitchen tools around her were suddenly potential weapons, and years of training in unconventional warfare kicked in with the kind of muscle memory that bypassed conscious thought. The second attacker moved toward the kitchen entrance, clearly following a predetermined plan that targeted specific personnel. Elena understood that she was likely the primary objective, and her operational background made her the logical focus for whatever mission these men had been tasked to complete. She waited until the attacker cleared the kitchen entrance, then moved with the fluid efficiency that had characterized her knife work and food preparation. The ladle became something entirely different in her hands, a weapon that could deliver devastating force when wielded by someone who understood leverage and anatomy with deadly precision. The ceramic implement connected with the attacker's throat with surgical accuracy. The impact delivered with the kind of force that came from training in environments where hesitation meant death. He collapsed immediately, his weapon clattering across the kitchen floor as Elena transitioned to address the remaining threats. The third attacker had positioned himself to provide covering fire, but Elena's movement through the kitchen used the industrial equipment as cover, while she closed the distance with the kind of tactical awareness that came from years of urban warfare training. Her positioning was perfect, using angles and concealment that negated his weapon's advantage. She emerged from behind the steam table with the same measured precision that had characterized her food preparation, the ladle still in her hand but now clearly a weapon that had been transformed by skill and training into something lethal. The remaining attackers found themselves facing someone who moved with the kind of professional competence that suggested they'd seriously underestimated their target. The engagement lasted less than 30 seconds, with Elena neutralizing all three attackers using nothing more than kitchen implements and the kind of tactical skills that most people associated with special operations personnel. The mess hall filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the sharp sounds of impact, but Elena's movements remained controlled and precise throughout. When the immediate threat was eliminated, Elena stood among the unconscious attackers with the same calm composure she'd shown during food preparation. The ladle in her hand was chipped from the impacts, but she held it with the casual familiarity of someone who'd just completed routine work rather than a life or death confrontation. Colonel Hartwell arrived with security personnel within minutes, his expression shifting from concern to amazement as he assessed the scene. 3 armed attackers neutralized by kitchen staff using improvised weapons was unprecedented in his experience, and Elena's calm demeanor suggested capabilities that went far beyond standard military training. "Ms. Vasquez," Hartwell said, studying the scene with the kind of professional assessment that senior officers applied to exceptional situations, "I believe we need to have a more comprehensive discussion about your background and qualifications." Elena set down the damaged ladle and straightened her apron with the same methodical attention she'd given to food preparation. "I believe my assignment here is complete, Colonel. These men were likely sent to eliminate someone with my operational history, and their failure means other attempts will follow." The statement was delivered with the matter-of-fact tone that Elena used for routine observations, but it carried implications that made everyone in the mess hall understand they'd been witnessing something extraordinary. Elena wasn't just a competent chef who'd handled a crisis well. She was someone whose background made her a target for the kind of people who used lethal force to achieve their objectives. Hartwell nodded, understanding that Elena's presence at Fort Meridian had been compromised by whatever forces had sent the attackers. Her cover assignment had been blown, and continued presence would endanger base personnel who weren't equipped to handle the kind of threats that came with her operational history. "Where will you go?" Hartwell asked, though his tone suggested he understood the answer might be classified. Above his clearance level, Elena moved toward the kitchen exit with the same measured pace that had characterized her work since arriving at Fort Meridian. "Wherever they need someone with my particular skill set," she replied, echoing the words she'd used during her conversation with Colonel Easley weeks earlier. The soldiers who'd mocked her initial assignment watched Elena's departure with the kind of stunned recognition that came from understanding they'd completely misjudged someone whose capabilities were beyond their comprehension. Morrison's documented mockery had become evidence of his failure to recognize excellence, and the footage he'd captured would serve as a permanent reminder of the dangers of making assumptions. Elena walked out of the mess hall with the same quiet dignity she'd maintained throughout her assignment, leaving behind soldiers who'd learned that strength came in many forms and that respect should be given freely until someone proved they didn't deserve it. The damaged ladle remained on the prep counter, a small reminder that ordinary tools could become extraordinary weapons in the right hands. Her departure marked the end of an assignment that had been meant to be quiet and routine, but had instead become an education in the importance of recognizing competence regardless of its packaging. The soldiers who'd served under her leadership would carry those lessons forward, understanding that the most capable people often chose not to announce their capabilities. The next morning brought a different kind of silence to the Fort Meridian mess hall. Elena's absence was felt in every corner of the kitchen, from the prep station where she demonstrated knife skills that had amazed her staff to the serving line where her coordination had transformed chaos into efficiency. The soldiers who'd gathered for breakfast moved with the subdued energy of people who'd witnessed something that changed their understanding of the world around them. Private Davis stood at Elena's former workstation, holding the chipped ceramic ladle that had become something legendary in the span of 30 seconds. The simple kitchen tool felt different in his hands now, weighted with the knowledge of what it had accomplished in the grip of someone who understood how to transform ordinary objects into instruments of protection. "She left this for us," Davis said quietly to the assembled kitchen staff, his voice carrying the reverence that people showed to artifacts with historical significance. "Like she wanted us to remember that strength doesn't always look the way we expect it to." Sergeant Thompson nodded, his expression reflecting the mixture of respect and regret that came from recognizing excellence only after it was gone. We had someone extraordinary working alongside us, and most of us were too blind to see it. She could have told us who she was, demanded the respect her service record deserved, but she chose to earn it through her work instead. The breakfast preparation continued without Elena's guidance, but her influence was visible in every aspect of the operation. The kitchen staff moved with the coordination she'd taught them, maintained the quality standards she'd established, and approached their work with the professional pride she'd demonstrated daily. Her assignment had been temporary, but her impact would be permanent. Morrison entered the mess hall with the haunted expression of someone who'd spent sleepless hours confronting his own failures. The phone footage he'd captured now served as documentation of his inability to recognize competence, and his role in mocking Elena had become a source of personal shame rather than social entertainment. "I recorded everything," Morrison said to Davis, his voice carrying the weight of genuine remorse. "Every moment of mockery, every stupid comment, every assumption that made me look like an idiot. I thought I was documenting her failure, but I was actually creating evidence of my own ignorance." Davis accepted Morrison's phone and scrolled through the footage, seeing Elena's quiet professionalism contrasted with the cruel commentary that had accompanied her first weeks at the base. The videos told a story about assumptions, respect, and the dangerous arrogance that came from judging people based on surface appearances. "Maybe that's the point," Davis said thoughtfully. "Maybe we need to remember how wrong we were, so we don't make the same mistakes with the next person who doesn't fit our expectations of what strength looks like." The morning shift brought Lieutenant Colonel Wells to the mess hall, her presence indicating that Elena's departure had been reported through official channels to the base command structure. Wells had reviewed the classified files that explained Elena's background, and her expression carried the mixture of admiration and regret that came from understanding what the base had lost. "She could have served anywhere," Wells announced to the assembled soldiers, her voice carrying the authority that made junior personnel listen carefully. "Someone with her operational history and security clearance could have chosen assignments that recognized her capabilities and provided the respect her service record deserved. Instead, she chose to work in a kitchen, feeding soldiers and teaching through example rather than demanding recognition." The soldiers who'd witnessed Elena's final act understood that they'd been privileged to observe something extraordinary. A woman who'd spent years in the most dangerous environments the military could offer, choosing to serve quietly in a role that most people would consider beneath her qualifications, then demonstrating skills that saved lives when the situation demanded it. Master Sergeant Reeves approached the group with a manila folder containing the portions of Elena's service record that could be shared without violating security protocols. The documents revealed enough information to help the soldiers understand the magnitude of what they'd witnessed and the significance of Elena's choice to serve without recognition. "This is what quiet heroism looks like," Reeves said, her voice carrying the respect that came from understanding Elena's true background. "Someone who doesn't need to announce their capabilities, doesn't demand recognition for their achievements, and chooses to serve wherever they're needed most." The damaged ladle remained on display in the mess hall, mounted in a place of honor where soldiers could see it daily. Beneath it, A simple plaque bore 6 words that captured everything Elena had taught them. Quiet is not the same as weak. Elena Vasquez had disappeared into whatever classified assignment awaited someone with her unique qualifications, but her lessons remained. The soldiers who'd learned from her would carry forward the understanding that strength came in many forms, that respect should be given freely until someone proved they didn't deserve it, and that the most capable people often chose not to announce their capabilities. Have you ever completely misjudged someone based on first impressions? Ever dismissed quiet competence because it didn't match your expectations of what strength should look like? Elena's story reminds us that heroes walk among us every day, often choosing service over recognition, substance over style. Drop your thoughts in the comments below about times you've witnessed quiet strength that almost went unnoticed. Hit that like button if this story changed how you think about the power of humility and the danger of assumptions. Subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss these tales of extraordinary people doing extraordinary things in ordinary circumstances. Share this with someone who needs to understand that legends don't always announce themselves. Sometimes they just show up, do the work, and leave quietly, making everyone around them better in the process.